Thank you, everybody, for coming to the Aaron Torres Podcast YouTube page. If you could do me a quick favor, if you do enjoy the video that you came here to watch, do me a favor, go ahead and hit that little red subscribe button at the bottom of the screen. It really does help my audience grow. It really does help this channel grow. It means more than you realize. So go ahead, hit that little red button. Also, remember, full episodes of the Aaron Torres Podcast, wherever you download your podcast, Apple, Spotify, etc. Now, here is the video that you came here for.
So here is the deal. This is what I want to do. Normally we wait until Sunday night or Monday morning here on the Aaron Torres Pod YouTube channel to react to the big news from the weekend in sports, specifically college football, college basketball. But on Saturday, we got a result that was so big, and in my opinion, the way it went down, so shocking that we could not wait until Monday to react to it. I am, of course, talking about Michigan, Ohio State. Ohio State at home is a 7.5-point favorite in the Betfred Sportsbook. How about this? We find out Saturday morning, Blake Corum's star Michigan running back is unavailable to go. The line gets all the way up to 9, and absolutely none of it matters, as Michigan does exactly what they did last year, only bigger, better, and on the road, just absolutely obliterating Ohio State 45-23 in Columbus. Hail to the Victors. 2 games in a row for Michigan, 2 losses in a row for Ohio State, and there is so much to react to. We're going to do a quick reaction now, and then we'll come back and do the full reaction on Monday's Aaron Torres Pod. But to me, what I find interesting about this game is that I do think it plays into what I say very often in life. I said, what do I always say on this show? 2 things in life can be true, even 2 things that seemingly seem counterintuitive, right? And so with the Ohio State-Michigan game, I'll say this. On the one hand, I did pick Michigan to win this game outright. On the other hand, especially in light of the Blake Corum news, it felt like if there was ever a time that Ohio State was going to get Michigan, things will never be set up better than they were this year. The game is at home. You're, of course, coming off a brutal loss last year to Michigan that cost you pretty much everything you were playing for a year ago. The weather is nice, not going to be a factor. Obviously, last year it was cold and snowy and icy in Ann Arbor. You're at home. Weather's in your favor. You're coming off a loss. You're playing for everything just like you do pretty much every year if you're Ohio State coming into the Michigan game. And then, like I said, oh, by the way, we basically find out at kickoff that Blake Corum, who I think should be in New York as a Heisman finalist, is essentially unavailable to go. And so everything is set up for Ohio State. And I will tell you when I started to get worried about Ohio State. I started to get worried about Ohio State in about the middle of the second quarter, when it was clear that Michigan could not move the ball on the ground. They could not do what has made them all successful, and Ohio State could not capitalize. They could not jump out beyond, I think it was 10-3 at some point. They couldn't get that 2-score lead. They couldn't get that 17-3 margin. They couldn't create separation. Instead, J.J. McCarthy hits a few passes. All of a sudden, the game is basically knotted up going into halftime. And that is when I got worried about Ohio State. And as I said, 2 things in life can be true. I picked Michigan. Everything was favored. Everything was breaking in Ohio State's favor coming in. But ultimately, why Ohio State lost this game goes back to why I picked Michigan to win. I said on my show on Monday, on Wednesday, on our Black Friday show when I previewed this game, I said there is no doubt, and by the way, this isn't a super unique opinion from my perspective, but I said, look, Ohio State's the more talented team. Nobody's debating that. But they have also been inconsistent. And what I said all week, I said when a team shows you who they are, believe them. Ohio State is more talented, but Ohio State has been more inconsistent all year. I think you can really look at 4 to 5 different games where they were really on the ropes and could have lost. Trailed at half to Notre Dame, where it was able to pull it out. The Iowa game, if you remember, we talked about it on this show. Early on in that game, defense keeps forcing turnovers, keeps making plays. Ohio State's offense can't move the ball. Ohio State has to settle for 5 field goals in the first half against Iowa. Now they end up putting up 50 points, but that was because Iowa's offense can't move the ball. They can't stay on the field, and the defense was just exhausted by the end. You have the Penn State game where Ohio State trailed midway through the fourth quarter and basically the defense bailed them out with one play after another, after another, after another. You have the Northwestern game, which was sloppy and ugly. And you had the Maryland game last week where, again, I felt like I was taking crazy pills. Maryland had the ball with under a minute to go, driving with the opportunity to beat Ohio State. Again, to the credit of Ohio State's defense, they can't come up with the big play to win the game. But why I picked Michigan, I said, Ohio State has been telling you who they are all year. Believe them. And that's exactly what happened. And so as we look beyond the game on Saturday, where Michigan gets its biggest win in Columbus since the 70s, in a game where they could not run the ball at all, yet still found a way to finish with 250 yards rushing when it was all said and done. And when I say they couldn't run the ball, I mean early in the game, Donovan Edwards, 2 big runs late to seal the victory. But what I'm saying and what I'm talking about is this. There is one thing that comes to mind when I evaluate this game and when I talk about the big picture of this game. To me, what this game comes down to is one simple thing. Blame falls on one specific person, and that specific person is Ryan Day. And when I think about this loss and when I think about the tough questions that we have to ask about Ryan Day, one specific thing comes to mind. Do you remember what Jim Harbaugh said after the Ohio State-Michigan game last year when Michigan won? He said, some people were born on third base and think they hit a triple. He was, of course, talking about Ryan Day, but I'm going to be blunt. After this game, after the second year in a row where Michigan takes care of Ohio State, I'm just going to say it. Jim Harbaugh is dead right on Ryan Day. And so when I look at this, here is the bigger picture. Here is what you need to know about Ryan Day, okay? You look at Ryan Day's situation. I don't think anyone would argue. He took over what I would argue outside of Alabama was the best infrastructure in college football at the time from Urban Meyer. If you remember, there were no real wholesale changes after that first season. Basically, you kind of kept the staff in place. You kept the strength and conditioning in place. You keep the off-the-field developmental things in place. And Ryan Day's first year, he was legitimately awesome, right? They go to the college football playoff. They play Clemson. It was a game. There was a lot of sketchy calls late. I would argue, by the way, Ohio State was still up 16-0 in that game, found a way to lose. And so year one, you say, Ryan Day is awesome. Ohio State's not missing a beat. They're destroying everybody. If the refs didn't bail them out against Clemson, potentially, maybe they're playing for a national championship. That was the year they would have played LSU and Joe Burrow. Year two, okay, we're a little bit more removed now from the Urban Meyer era. A few guys like Jeffrey Okudah, Chase Young go pro. Okay, what happens in year two? Well, that, of course, is the COVID year. Remember, COVID situation happens. Ohio State, Big Ten isn't going to play, limited to 6 games. And even that season, you started to see the holes, you started seeing the little water flooding through the dam that ends up now being the Titanic here 2 years later. But they played just 6 games. They struggle against Indiana that season. They do win the Big Ten championship game against Northwestern. But remember, that was a game that they trailed Northwestern at halftime. They rallied to win. And if you remember that year, there was actually a conversation until Notre Dame lost on the final day of the regular season of whether Ohio State should be left out of the college football playoff. So Ohio State gets in, they play for a title, but they're not quite as good as the year before. Then we have last year where, of course, they take 2 losses. They lose to Oregon at home. They lose to Michigan on the road, don't win the Big Ten East, don't win a Big Ten championship, don't make the college football playoff. Fast forward to this year, and what happens there? Well, you beat a bunch of teams that it really doesn't matter that you beat. The one game that it matters, the one game that you have spent your whole year preparing for, you play at home against the Wolverines and you get destroyed. And so that's why this falls on Ryan Day. Because at least last year, Ryan Day could argue, well, we weren't good, but it wasn't really my offense. We're not tough enough in the trenches. Our defense needs a schematic overhaul. And so what happens? This offseason, Ryan Day goes out and hires a new O-line coach, goes out and hires, obviously, Jim Knowles, the defensive coordinator. And I'll be blunt, on Saturday in Columbus, it kind of looked a lot like last year against Michigan. And so it falls on Ryan Day. There is no one else to have excuses for other than Ryan Day. There's no one to blame other than Ryan Day. And I'll say this, anyone who can't see that this program is going in the wrong direction, I don't know what to tell you. Think about this. I saw this stat. Well, I found this stat. I'll give myself a little credit, and I put it on my social media Twitter feed. Do you know that in Ryan Day's last 8 games against top 15 teams, that dates back to the 2020 national title game where they got destroyed by Alabama. In his last 8 games against top 15 teams, Ryan Day is 4-4 overall. Okay. Lost to Alabama in the title game, lost to Oregon last year, lost to Michigan last year, lost to Michigan this year. Beyond that, in 3 of the 4 games in which they won against top 15 teams, they trailed at the half in 3 of those 4 games. Notre Dame earlier this year, Penn State earlier this year, and then last year in the Rose Bowl against Utah. And so essentially, we're now talking about a 2-year sample size with Ryan Day, where you look at that team, Ohio State in big games against teams with pseudo-comparable talent, anyone with a pulse, basically. Ohio State has looked like Ohio State in exactly one of those games. That was against Michigan State last year, which you may remember was in the top 15 at the time. I think they were in the top 10. And they also happen to have the worst pass defense in college football last year. That is the one time that Ohio State has looked like Ohio State. And so to me, what's fascinating now is what happens next. Now, obviously, one thing that happened during that game, Clemson loses. So it now sort of opens up a situation where, as I record, there is a backdoor into the college football playoff for Ohio State. You know, you look ahead, and if TCU takes a loss, if USC takes a loss, Ohio State's right back in this thing as a potential wild card entry to the college football playoff. But to me, it's so fascinating what happens next with Ryan Day, right? Because this is a guy, and I'm not saying he's going to get fired, and I'm not saying this, I'm not saying he's that, but he gets paid $10 million a year. And in the last 2 years, anytime his team has played anyone with comparable talent, it has been a war. It has been a fight. And I think what's especially disappointing with Ohio State fans, you're getting out toughed, you're getting out physicaled. I don't think anybody thinks Michigan has more talent than Ohio State, and this one falls square on Ryan Day. So we will have more on Monday's Aaron Torres pod. Make sure you're subscribed to this YouTube channel. Make sure you're subscribed to the Aaron Torres pod on Apple, Spotify, whatever. But what a day for Michigan. Congrats to Michigan on getting the upset. And we got some tough questions to ask about Ryan Day.